Thanks to the FaceBase Consortium for the invitation to address you today. Dr. Hallgrímsson and I are reporting on an 18-month collaboration by Applied Research Associates and the Cummings School of Medicine at the University of Calgary. Our research was performed as part of a project to develop and produce an N95 level elastomeric respirator, a face mask for adults, that was funded by the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, or BARDA. And our work has been published recently in the journal Applied Ergonomics. Next slide, please. I want to give my thanks to our co-authors who generously shared their data and insights, and also support from NIDCR as well as the Canadian First Research Excellence Fund, National Science and Engineering Research Council of Canada, and the Canadian Foundation for Innovation. Next slide, please. Sure. So our key points we'd like to share with you today are that respirator options for children are limited. The existing designs do not consider the differences in facial shape or size. Facial measurements and the proportions change as children grow. They're just not small adults, and they must be accounted for. This requires accurate data that reflects facial changes that occur during growth in order to design and produce a suitable pediatric respirator. And we created a database of children's facial images from 3 cohorts and then used geometric morphometric analysis of the dense and sparse facial landmark representations to quantify age, sex, and ancestry-related variation in shape. Next slide. And briefly, we found facial shape and size in children vary significantly with age from 2 to 18, particularly in dimensions that are relevant to respirator design, as sex differences are small throughout most of the age range of our sample. However, ancestry is associated with significant facial shape variation in dimensions that may affect respirator fit. We offer guidance on how our results can be used for the appropriate design of devices, such as respirators for pediatric populations. And we also highlight the need to consider ancestry-related variation in facial morphology in order to promote equitable and inclusive products. Next slide, please. Well, in 1977, Snyder et al. Conducted a study on behalf of the Consumer Product Safety Commission in order to promote and support safe product design, and the project used conventional measurements, such as you see in the image here, on a sample of 4,127 infants and up to 24 months, and children in use aged 2 to 18 years. Our project team reviewed published literature on pediatric anthropometry and eventually identified the NIDCR FaceBase Consortium as a definitive resource for the data that we needed for this project. The 3D Facial Norms project filled the need for available, comprehensive, normative, anthropometric 3D facial surface data sets for public research. And as a consortium member, the Hallgrímsson Laboratory at University of Calgary Cummings School of Medicine had access to the needed data and, lucky for us, was happy to collaborate on the project. I was very glad to be able to work not only with Benedikt, but also with Hallgrímsson. So now Benedikt will describe our project in more detail. Over to you, Benedikt.
Thanks, Chris. And I just want to start by saying I apologize to people I know who are there, that I'm not there in person. I do have a good excuse. Our daughter graduated yesterday. We had a fantastic day yesterday. And so I'm actually not that sorry that I didn't go, but I am sorry I'm not there in person to meet friends and colleagues. So when I think it was Chris Williams who suggested to Chris Nemeth that he contact us to get some help with the project. And when I first heard about it, I was quite intrigued, and I told him that yes, we do have both data and expertise to help you with this. And specifically, we decided to apply, not just the 3D facial norms data, which is based on the Pittsburgh North American European derived GWAS, but rather a wider data set of facial images that are also within FaceBase, mostly with the exception of one of the cohorts that we had access to as well. And so the total sample that we analyzed includes almost 8,000 kids, aged 2 to 18, and the distributions by by sex and also by ancestry are shown in these graphs. Now these are 3D facial images. I know many people will be familiar with this. We subject these to the automated registration and analysis pipeline that we've developed over the years. There's an animation here that just shows that in operation. And in addition, we subject these data to extensive cleaning and quality control before we were able to use them for the practical purpose of helping to design masks for children. Now, when Chris and I discussed this first, he showed that picture that they showed earlier of Snyder et al. 1977, and the specific request was around linear distances, and I pushed back a little bit, and then but I acquiesced eventually, and we used our automatically registered 3D meshes to generate a set of linear distances that are compatible with the prior literature. And this is important because you need to be able to compare the results of these current analyses to the results of prior work. I should note though that I couldn't even get Hannah to do this, because she didn't see the point. So I actually had to generate all of these graphs, and that was the first deliverable in the project, was to create these age trajectories for linear distances by both sex and ancestry from these data. They look like this. I'm not going to go through these individually, but this was the first pass through the data that the engineers wanted to see. Now, the problem, of course, is that humans or human faces aren't just linear distances. And in fact, those linear distances have a relationship to each other. They have a covariance structure, which is, of course, relates to shape. And the interesting thing about human faces is the shape, and it is in fact the shape that determines how well masks fit. And so I was able to fairly easily actually convince Chris that analyzing the full 3D facial shape variation was the way to go here. And in so doing, I think we ended up doing work that I actually found to be quite interesting, because it showed a pathway to connect some of the analyses that we've done on 3D facial shape variation to a practical output, in this case, the development of an important product that helps children. Now, the first thing to recognize about 3D facial shape variation is that it's highly integrated. In other words, it has a covariance structure, and that covariance structure is highly structured. And this is useful for product design because you can characterize this structure in a way that you can then extract information that can summarize facial shape variation in ways that are useful to engineers. And I'm showing you here just the animations of the first 15 principal components for 3D facial shape variation. These first 15 components explain something like 92% of the total variation in facial shape, which again is useful because it allows for a nice way of summarizing the totality of facial shape variation. And so this is what that looks like. And here I've just shown the first 3 principal components. And this is work that Hannah did, and what she's done here is centered this principal components analysis on different ages. In this case, age 2, age 10, and then age 18. And one thing that you can see just from these plots, and we did quantitative analysis to support that, is that although there is a lot of variation in facial shape with age, in fact, it's the predominant source of variation. It supports the idea that you should develop specific mask designs for children. For example, the faces of children aren't just smaller versions of adult faces. They are different in shape. So even though age is the predominant source of variation in facial shape, the covariance structure around those means tends to be fairly stable across the age. And this is useful, I think, in terms of the ability to summarize these data and to use them for product design. So what we did in terms of creating an output that the engineers could use then was to create these sets of 3D morphs. And I've just shown an example here for the first principal component. We did this for 15 principal components. And of course, associated with that was the amount of variation that was explained by each of these. And at specific intervals along these components, we generated 3D facial morphs, and we did this for 5 different age groups. And so, and in these, we also preserved scale. So we were then able to just give to the engineers, this is what a face looks like at -2 standard deviations for principal component 1 at age 4. And so you then have this population of theoretical faces that together basically encapsulate something approximating the totality of facial shape variation of the population that they were trying to design something for. In addition to so age, of course, is a predominant source of variation. But in addition to that, there is a significant amount of variation by ancestry, and this, of course, is a complex topic and one that brings up both practical considerations and also considerations relating to the use of genomic ancestry for purposes like this. But just in terms of the quantification of facial shape variation, we found both in the data sets that we had, and I should say those are somewhat biased in the sense that they're predominantly composed of children of European descent who are in North America. So this is the GWAS led by Seth Weinberg, Schaefer, and Mary Marizita. And then RG was of Tanzanian children, which is East Africans, along with additional kids that come from the FaceBase 2 study, who are more diverse, but still predominantly of European descent. In addition to that, though, we had access to data from Mark Shriver's that is much more geographically diverse. And in that data set, he had calculations of genomic ancestry as well as a classification by superpopulation. And so we found in these analyses that about 15% of the total facial shape variance is explained by the superpopulation membership. And so let me just put some of those results in context. So here's a canonical variance analysis, which of course emphasizes the extent of difference between these superpopulation groups. And here are exaggerated means shown for 3 of the superpopulations. And you can see that on the first canonical variant, you have the distinguishing features of African and European populations. And on the third CV, we have a South Asian versus East Asian. And you can look at these data in a variety of different ways. You can use the NIH race classification, which I think is probably the least useful one. You can use the superpopulation one, again, which doesn't really capture human geographic variation because it isn't discretely patterned in these kinds of groups, but it's rather continuously distributed across geography. And you can use genomic ancestry, which was the measure that Shriver's et al. Had used in their study. And you can see here that a significant amount of variation, but less than 15% in total is explained by these various classifications. 6% only is explained by global genomic ancestry. So what that means, of course, is that, and this is well known, the majority of facial shape variation, as for other complex traits and as for genomic variants, exists within populations as opposed to among populations. The area where this impacts things like the design of products, however, is that there may be specific features that vary strongly with ancestry. And even though the majority of variation for some of those variables may be within populations, you may have, particularly at extremes, variation that is more common in some groups than others. And so if you don't take those differences into account in product design, you may end up with products that are less suited for some people compared to others. And so this is not what we would like in terms of equitable and inclusive design of products. And the specific features that we found for facial shape variation, they mainly actually distinguish African and European populations, and they have to do with nasal width and projection, as well as orofacial prognatism. And these actually are specific aspects of facial shape variation that impact the design of masks. And so this was something that was important to take into account. Again, even though the majority of variation, even in those particular features, exists within as opposed to between populations. But these findings do point towards the need to better understand the totality of human facial shape variation across the range of geographic ancestry in a better sample than what we have to work with here, to support an inclusive and equitable design for devices like respirator masks. And finally, just to close closes in terms of the overall findings that came out of our analysis. I think it's clear, of course, that age-related variation is nonlinear across cell growth, and it really needs to be considered when you develop products like this. Children aren't just smaller adults, and they should have access to products that fit their faces, particularly when it comes to critical things like respirators, where you need them to fit properly. And the methods that we use, the geometry morphometric approaches, the use of in this case this linear multivariate models for approximating facial shape variation. There are a variety of other statistical techniques, including machine learning based ones that one could use for this sort of thing, and we certainly have played around with those sorts of things. But the bottom line is that the quantification of facial shape variation using these methods has tremendous potential for ergonomic design, particularly when that variation is structured in ways that may not necessarily be obvious to engineers who are not used to thinking about how biological variation works. And we can use that information to inform the structure of variation in ways that can help them make decisions, particularly when, as was the case in this study, the number of specific models that they were going to produce is limited by practical considerations. And so it's an important question. If you create 3 different masks, what proportion of the population are those 3 different masks actually going to fit? And in order to answer that question, you have to understand the structure of variation in the face and how that's distributed across the population. So I think I'm going to turn that over to Chris now to close this up. Thanks.
So thanks, Benedikt. So I'll briefly describe how these data and analyses can inform respirator design. Using these data for respirator design can start by normalizing baselines for the study's head models and using the International Standard Organization, or ISO, head forms. And then computer-aided design models can then be developed for the respirator that align with the normalized head models, and the respirator models fit with the study's head forms can be used to identify optimal fit target zones, as Benedikt mentioned just a moment ago. The facial seal model can then be used to determine and evaluate seal contact surfaces and target zones. And determining both facial contact surfaces and the compressed contact surfaces can verify the match between facial shape and mask seal. Evaluation of the fit across age groups can identify adjustments that might be needed in order to better suit pediatric morphologies. And fit evaluation can also identify crossover areas for which mask flexion and facial variation could allow for a size larger or smaller than might be expected for a user in order to be comfortable. The use of fit and crossover areas can determine how many sizes would be required to accommodate a pediatric population based on a given design concept, and the CAD model can then be used in order to produce physical prototypes for fit evaluation. Next slide, please. We mentioned one limitation here, and that is that the composition of the underlying data, as well as the complexity of human geographic variation, complicates inferences from data sets such as the one that we have analyzed here. Next slide, please. And in summary, the study results using 3D white light photogrammetry facial meshes made it possible to depict a pediatric sample more efficiently and accurately than previous manual linear measurement methods. And it also supported the creation of an N95 level elastomeric respirator suited to a pediatric population. And the project summary data are expected to provide further benefit by being available for use through the NIDCR FaceBase hub. Thank you for your interest, and hope that we might be able to answer any questions.
Yeah, so any questions for Chris or Chris and Benedikt? Any questions from the remote audience? Yes, Pedro.
Hi, Benedikt. This is Pedro. I loved how there was so much variation, but then there's limited areas where there's specific variation. So do you think the masks that are designed can inform, like, where do they put different polymers that have more compliance, or, you know, not everything is uniform, but just address those specific areas that have so much variability?
Yeah, this actually, that was a topic that we discussed quite a bit. And it comes into the engineering of the product as well, because as Chris was saying earlier, the masks are deformable, they do fit. And so it's pretty complex modeling that the engineer were doing, or actually are doing still, I think, to relate the pliability of the face, and given its shape, to the pliability of the mask. But to answer your question, yeah, I think there are extremes of facial shape variation that are incompatible with those two things, and so you need to know where the limits are, because if you don't, then you end up designing a product that ends up not fitting a portion of the population. If that portion of the population happens to be of a particular background, you've created a design that is not equitable. Does that answer your question? Or?
Yeah, no, it's very good. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you, Chris, for connecting us on this project.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And it was the whole team. Yeah, we're like, oh, you got to talk to Benedikt. Okay, great. And so